Welcome, dear listener, to Stories for Sleep-a Place, where the past unfolds gently, and history tiptoes in to keep you company as you drift off to rest. Tonight, we open the lid quite literally on a tale that's as curious as it is courageous. The story of a man who mailed himself to freedom. But of course, that's only the beginning. There's so much more. So fluff your pillow, breathe deeply, and settle into the rhythm of another world, one filled with wooden floors, the hush of candlelight, the rustle of paper, and the creak of wagons. Tonight, we will travel slowly through the story of Henry, Box Brown, and the many textures of the world he came from day by quiet day. And if you enjoy drifting through these ancient pathways, don't forget to subscribe and let us know where and when you listen. We're glad to have you here. Now let's begin, not with motion, but with stillness. Before there was a box and a plan, before there was even the flicker of escape, there was the ordinary in that heavy, quietly aching way that made it both forgettable and unforgettable. Imagine a dusty morning in antebellum Virginia. The air is thick with pollen and the scent of crushed leaves, somewhere between damp and warm. It's a weekday, which means little to most, but everything to those who work from sunup to sundown. Under someone else's sky, you wake before dawn. You do not wake by choice. There is no clock in your room, because there is no room, and there certainly is no clock. The rooster belongs to the master's yard, but its crowing rings in your bones like a bell tolling time. Your bed is a bundle of old straw wrapped in a threadbare sheet, softened only slightly by habit. You stretch slowly, not to savor the morning, but to coax your limbs into cooperation. They're sore, but always are. The first task is not yours. It's the weather's. If the sky hints at rain, the fields may hold a different kind of punishment. Mud is crueler than dryness in some ways, but either way, your day is mapped out in advance shaped by the hands of others, unbendable, like a fence you can see, but not cross. You shuffle into motion. Your shirt smells of earth and fire smoke. The buttons are mismatched. You've long stopped caring. Breakfast is cornmeal mush, still warm, eaten quickly and standing. Conversations happen in glances, in quiet gestures, a nod, a sigh, a look down the row. You are property. This is said aloud sometimes, but mostly it's implied. It's in the way you are spoken to and around. It's in the way your time is borrowed, spent, and never returned. It's not just the work, it's the weight. It's knowing that you do not own your own tomorrow. But even in that world, there is rhythm. Rhythm can be a kind of resistance. A humming voice while hoeing. A tap of fingers on wood while waiting. A shared joke so quiet it floats away on the breeze before the overseer hears it. A small bit of humanity folded carefully into the corners of the day. And then there are boxes, not the famous one, not yet, but crates, barrels, containers of all kinds, used for storing dried tobacco, cotton, or goods too valuable to leave lying around. You become familiar with their feel, their weight, their smellwood soaked with sun, sweat, and time. You pack them, carry them, stack them. You know which ones creak when moved, which are stronger, which seem empty but are actually full of unseen weight. The irony is gentle but sharp. The boxes, at least, have destinations. As you work, you dream. Quietly, carefully. Not too loud, not too bright, because dreams are dangerous here. You might dream of freedom, but freedom is not a location. It's an idea so large it hardly fits into words. It's not a map, but a direction. North, always north. Where things are said to be different, though how different is unclear. Up there, people say, you might walk freely. Up there, a man might speak without flinching. You hear things. Names of towns, whispered plans, stories of others who vanished in the night and maybe made it. But mostly you keep still. Your face says nothing, even when your mind is burning. You meet someone, maybe an older man, who once saw Canada with his own eyes, or a woman whose brother slipped away with forged papers. These whispers are seeds, planted in the soil of your longing. You don't dare water them too quickly, but they grow, slowly. And one day, maybe, while lifting a barrel, or watching a wagon roll away, you wonder, could a person fit inside? Could they seal it up just so? Could the box that usually carries cotton carry a man instead? For now, it's only a passing thought. But the day ends, and the sky turns pink, and the bugs begin their evening choir. You return to your corner, your blanket, your little spot under the stars or in the shadow of the barn. You close your eyes, not to dream, but to survive another night. And somewhere in the dark, the box waits. Let's meet the man behind the plan, not yet inside the box, but very much in the world that shaped him. His name was Henry Brown. No middle initial yet. No wooden nickname. Just Henry. Born into slavery in Louisa County, Virginia, probably. In the year 1815, though no one wrote it down on a certificate. Paper, like freedom, was for others. Henry's early life was familiar in that grim and quietly cruel way. He was born into enslavement, his family scattered like loose pages in a gust of wind. Parents, siblings, cousins always nearby, yet never guaranteed. The plantation system had no regard for closeness. Affection existed, but permanence didn't. Henry's. Enslavers lent him out as a child, which was a common practice, a reminder that even labor was transferable, like grain or cloth. His value was not just in muscle, but in potential output. It wasn't about what he felt, but what he produced. This was the arithmetic of the age. A person's worth tallied in pounds of tobacco and hours of toil. And yet, like all human beings, Henry had an interior world. He had thoughts, preferences, frustrations, small joys. He liked music. He liked order. He appreciated neatness, which later would prove useful when calculating the dimensions of a box meant for survival. Eventually, Henry was moved to Richmond, Virginia, a bustling city with paved streets and steeples and smoke rising from foundries. He was put to work in a tobacco factory. Picture it, cavernous rooms, a scent of leaf and dust, long wooden tables where laborers rolled, pressed, and packed tobacco with aching fingers and bowed backs. The windows let in light, but not much air. It was stifling in summer, cold in winter, and monotonous always. But Richmond, for all its oppression, had cracks in its walls. It was a city of commerce, yes, but also of movement. Wagons, rail cars, and crates came and went daily. People watched. People learned. Henry began to notice patterns. Who loaded what, when wagons left, how cargo was labeled, how inspectors glanced but rarely lingered. He also met others, both enslaved and free, who nurtured in him an idea. Escape was possible. It wasn't likely, but it was possible. The idea began to bloom slowly, like a cautious seed in poor soil. Henry married. Her name was Nancy, also enslaved. Their love was real, even if not legally recognized. Together they had children, but as always in slavery, love was fragile. The family could be and was torn apart. Nancy and the children were sold away. That was the moment, the break, the silent scream. Henry never forgot it. His heart, already battered, cracked wide open. That moment watching them vanish was when the plan truly began. The box, still just an idea, took on weight. He began to imagine escape, not just as an act of flight, but as a journey of stillness. If he could disappear, just for a while, he might reappear somewhere new. If he could stop moving just long enough, maybe the world would move him instead. And so the plan began, not with bold words or loud rebellion, but with measurements, with questions asked softly, with favors exchanged, with allies chosen carefully. It began with trust, an immensely valuable and dangerous thing. But before the plan could unfold, Henry would need to shrink his world. Shrink it down to 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2.5 feet high. A coffin for the living. A seed pod of freedom. A box, not of punishment, but of possibility. That day hadn't come yet, but it was near. Just a few more steps. Just a few more days. And so we rest here, at the threshold, quiet, watchful, and filled with breathless waiting. The box was not an accident. It was a project. Imagine the quiet precision of it. Not the storm of rebellion, not the clamor of a jailbreak. Just a man with a goal, measuring angles with trembling fingers, borrowing tape and counting inches with. The care of a carpenter building his own ark. Except this ark would not ride waves, it would cross states. It would not hold animals, it would hold one desperate soul. Henry Box Brown, as he would one day be known, didn't just climb into a crate on a whim. He orchestrated it down to the last sliver of wood and iron hinge. In the smoky hum of Richmond streets, among barrels and wagons and the clatter of horseshoes on cobblestones, he turned freedom into logistics. He found help in the unlikeliest of places. 2 men, 1 black, 1 white. Samuel Smith, a free black man with nerves of steel and deep convictions, and James C. A. Smith, a sympathetic white shoemaker. In a time when helping a fugitive slave was a federal crime with real consequences, these 2 men risked everything. They, too, understood that silence could be revolutionary. A plan didn't need trumpets. It needed tools. The crate itself was ordinary. Pine planks, rough, unpolished. About 3 feet long, just over 2 feet wide, and only 2.5 feet tall. Imagine curling yourself into that space, not for a moment, not for a test, but for a journey lasting hours, maybe days. Your knees pressed to your chest. Your back curved into a shape not meant to hold. Your body folded like a letter, sealed in wood, addressed to freedom. On the outside, it was labeled simply, dry goods. It was to be shipped from Richmond to Philadelphia via Adams Express Company, a private freight service known for speed and discretion. No questions asked, just packages passed along from train to wagon to cart, like whispers in a long corridor. They drilled 3 small air holes. 3, that was all. Just enough for breath to pass through like a rumor. No room for error. No second chances. Inside, Henry brought a few things. A small water bladder, a couple of biscuits, and the Bible. Not for comfort, he later said, but to read in case he died. He expected to die. Or rather, he expected that death was a perfectly reasonable outcome. But that, at least, would be his choice. For once. On the morning of March 23, 1849, Henry climbed in. He had burned his hand the day before with sulfuric acid, a self-inflicted wound that gave him an excuse to stay home from work and avoid suspicion. He bore the pain silently, for his body had endured worse. Pain was familiar. It was the unknowns that stirred the deeper fear. Samuel Smith nailed the lid shut. There was no speech, no dramatic farewell. Just hammer strikes in the early morning hush, like a builder finishing a final piece. With each nail, Henry disappeared from Virginia. Not physically yet, but spiritually, emotionally. With every blow, he stepped further from bondage. The crate was loaded. A wagon carted it to the rail depot. From there, it was transferred to a train bound north. Inside, Henry was still. Time did not pass. It stretched, curled, and folded in on itself, just like his cramped limbs. Darkness pressed in from all sides. He could not stretch, could not fully breathe, could not change position. He could only listen to the creak of the train, the shuffle of porters, the distant bark of dogs. At one point, the box was turned upside down. Yes, upside down. Henry's head pressed to the wooden floor of the crate. His weight shifted. His neck strained. He dared not cry out. His eyes, he would later say, nearly burst from their sockets. Blood pulsed in strange places. Still, he remained quiet. Still. For 27 hours, he did this. 27 hours. Curled in pine. No room to panic. No space to scream. And then finally Philadelphia. The box was delivered to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. When the crate was opened, a group of astonished abolitionists leaned over the edge, staring at what they had heard about, but never imagined so literally. Henry looked up, blinked. He said softly, humorously, "How do?" "You do, gentlemen?" And then, with great care, he stood up in the box. He sang, a hymn long and loud. And in that moment, his name was carved into history, not in stone, but in splinters and sweat. But before he could sing, before he could stand, before the box could open, there was the waiting. There was the journey. And now, with the lid closed behind us, let's step gently into the aftermath. You'd think that after climbing out of a box and into the arms of liberty, a man might finally rest. But freedom, it turns out, isn't instant peace. It's another kind of burden. A beautiful one, yes, but a burden nonetheless. Henry Brown was free, legally speaking. He stood in Philadelphia, a living miracle. But the law had long arms. The Fugitive Slave Act was still in place. Slave catchers lurked. At any moment, Henry could be seized, stuffed into a different box, a jail cell, and dragged back south. So the celebration was quiet. Grateful, yes, but cautious. Henry met with abolitionists, told his story, posed for portraits. He stood tall in a fine coat borrowed, perhaps, and let the world see what dignity looked like. He began performing, his tale as a kind of lecture, a one-man show, part testimony, part warning, part marvel. But still, Nancy and the children were gone. He wrote letters, offered money, pleaded for news. But slavery respected no family ties. The ones he had loved most were scattered like ash. In some versions of his story, Henry later remarried, choice that has drawn both sympathy and sorrow from historians. Who could blame him for starting again? Who could fault the ache of loneliness, the longing for connection? And yet, even in the North, Henry felt the tremors of danger. He moved again to Boston, and across the ocean to England. England, where slavery had been abolished years before, offered a different kind of peace. Not just legal safety, but emotional rest. He stayed there for years, telling his story, performing it, even taking up magic tricks to illustrate the box. Yes, magic, sleight of hand, disappearing acts. A man who once vanished into wood now made coins disappear from thin air. It was a strange transformation, but perhaps a fitting one. Survival had always been a performance, hadn't it? In time, he returned to America. The Civil War came and went. The Emancipation Proclamation. The slow uncoiling of centuries of bondage. But Henry's story never disappeared. It lived on in pamphlets, in newspapers, in memory. Today, we remember him as Box Brown. But he was more than a crate, more than a journey. He was a man who looked at the narrowest space imaginable and made it wide enough for freedom. And now, we will leave Henry here for the moment, sitting, upright on a wooden crate, singing his hymn. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but gently, as if to say, even boxes can bloom. Even silence can roar. Even stillness can carry you miles and miles. And the world, ever spinning, moves on. Let us pause now, not at the moment of escape, not even at the miracle of arrival, but further back in the days that bled into one another, back into the cadence of enslavement. Not the drama of the lash, not the courtroom or the field, but the mundane, what a day felt like, smelled like, how it folded around a person like a too tight coat. Imagine yourself waking up not to an alarm, but to someone else's expectation. The sun may still be below the horizon, but your body is already in motion. Perhaps your owner or overseer prefers his household to rise early. Perhaps he does not even live on the property, yet his control extends through others, like a hand wrapped in gloves. You awaken not in your own bed, but in a shared space cramped, stiff, your sleep often interrupted by the shuffles and coughs of others, packed tightly in. Breakfast, if one could call it that, might be cornmeal mush. It is not warm. It is not spiced. It is something to silence your stomach, not something to enjoy. If you were a domestic slave, as Henry Brown once was, your days were measured in linens folded, floors scrubbed, and trays balanced. The genteel calm of a Virginia household was often held together by the invisible labor of those who were never truly still. The carpets, the windows, the crisp white shirts worn by the master, these all bore the fingerprints of lives forced to polish them. Henry worked in a tobacco factory. Imagine the air there, thick, sweet, and bitter all at once, the leaves drying in bunches, the repetitive motion of hands sorting, pressing, binding, day in, day out, surrounded by rows of other men many enslaved, like you, whose hands moved with quiet choreography. Some whispered songs, others said nothing at all. Talking could bring punishment, or worse attention, but attention could also mean hope. For some, literacy was whispered from one person to the next, like contraband. A letter here, a passage from the Bible there. Henry, miraculously, learned to read. He absorbed words like light through cracks in the wall, and those words would stay with him, scripture, names, addresses, until they became tools sharper than any blade. The routine was numbing by design, predictable but not peaceful. One mistake, a slow step, a glance held too long, a comment taken the wrong way, could spiral into violence. The body learned to remain quiet even when the heart raged. Every task had a rhythm. Laundry had its rhythm. So did pouring water, lighting candles, carrying trays. That rhythm, for many, became survival. But there were breaks in the rhythm. Holidays, for instance, which offered temporary relief and yet remained tightly controlled. Or Sundays, the one day when spiritual life stirred quietly. Many enslaved people attended church, though which church and which preacher depended on the preferences of the master. Some were allowed to listen, some were expected to sing. The messages were often carefully curated: obedience, humility, patience. But even here, among the hymns and hand fans, subtle resistances bloomed. Biblical figures like Moses and Daniel began to feel less like moral examples and more like coded messengers. Liberation was not just a dream, it was prophecy. Children were present in this world, too. Henry had children. Their presence made escape heavier, more complicated. To leave meant to save yourself, but it also meant to leave someone behind. And so most stayed, not because they didn't long to run, but because they had mouths to feed, siblings to guard, elders to care for. Freedom is a beautiful word, but when it asks you to sacrifice your child, it becomes a cruel riddle. And so days stretched. The same food, the same path to work, the same cotton shirt, the same glance at the door, wondering not for the first time if you would be sold, not punished, not reprimanded, sold, packed and handed off like a letter, just as Henry's wife Nancy had been. The mechanics of slavery were not only built on violence, they were built on erosion. the slow wearing away of ownership over one's own time, thoughts, and family. Not through thunderclaps, but through routine. And it is that routine that makes Henry's later rebellion all the more extraordinary. To break free from iron chains is one thing. To break free from habit, from repetition, from the lull of despair, that is its own kind of miracle. So the box had its origin not in a sudden burst of courage, but in countless mornings of quiet pain, countless moments of forced stillness, and countless dreams of moving just once under one's own power. Let us carry that truth forward as we now shift our gaze. Before there was an escape, there had to be a map. Not a paper one with cities and rivers, but a human map made of glances, whispers, gestures, and sometimes letters written in invisible ink or hidden in the folds of trust. The Underground Railroad, despite its romantic name, was not a railroad at all. It had no steel tracks, no glowing lanterns to light the way. It was quiet, and it was careful. It thrived not on speed, but on caution. It existed in the soft murmurs between neighbors, in the hand that lingered a moment too long on a shoulder, pressing a note into a palm, in the door left ajar just long enough for someone to slip inside. Henry Brown did not arrive in Philadelphia by accident. His path was crafted by hands that did not seek fame. People like William Still, a free black man who kept meticulous notes on those who passed through his care names, dates, fragments of family lore. These records were hidden, buried deep, only to be unearthed after slavery's fall. William Still was, in many ways, the archivist of miracles. He recorded Henry's arrival in the box with solemn clarity. He noted how Henry unfolded himself like paper from an envelope. He marked the hymn he sang. And then he tucked the memory away like a fragile gift. There were many like Still, abolitionists of every stripe, black, white, Quaker, Baptist, Methodist, farmer, housewife. Some were bold, some were terrified. All were necessary. In Henry's case, the shipping plan required coordination. Adams Express Company was used precisely because it was private and fast. But not all deliveries went smoothly. Boxes were delayed, routes changed. Occasionally, crates were dropped. Henry was lucky to have allies. Lucky that no dogs sniffed too closely. Lucky that the men who handled his box had no questions. But luck, in those days, was often just another name for preparation. And so Henry's journey became more than just one man's story. It became a testament to networks unseen, to the silent army that wove freedom out of shadow. When we next continue, we'll step deeper into those networks. We'll explore how families were made and unmade, how geography became its own kind of prison, and how those who could read and dared to teach became targets of history's slow, grinding gaze. But for now, rest here, with names like Still, Smith, and Brown, with invisible railroads, with brave, quiet souls, because sometimes the loudest revolutions are carried out in a whisper. Imagine tracing your fingertip along a map, but instead of rivers and borders, you feel barriers lines not of terrain, but of threat. In 19th century America, geography itself became a kind of silent jailer. Where you lived determined not just what kind of work you did, but whether your life belonged to you at all. For an enslaved person like Henry Brown, the state of Virginia was not just home, it was a cage. Not a cage with bars, but one defined by laws and fences, overseers and neighbors. Freedom for him did not begin with an idea. It began with a location, Philadelphia. That name alone, whispered and passed from mouth to mouth, became a kind of North Star. And to get there, one had to cross not only physical miles, but 1,000 invisible checkpoints, each one laced with risk. Let's picture the world Henry lived in. Southern states such as Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas were deeply entrenched in the system of slavery. Plantations dominated the countryside, and cities, though more densely populated, offered little refuge. Surveillance was constant. Enslaved individuals were monitored not just by their enslavers, but by white neighbors, patrollers, and even free black people who might report runaways to avoid suspicion themselves. The closer one got to the Mason-Dixon line, the historical boundary between free and slave states, the more tightly wound the tension became. Crossing into Maryland or Delaware didn't guarantee safety. In fact, in many border states, danger could feel sharper because the illusion of freedom was so near, and yet laws like the Fugitive Slave Act gave legal permission to drag one's body back across the threshold of bondage. This meant that escape plans had to be precise, and every detail, no matter how small, mattered. The time of day, the weather, the position of the moon, whether your footsteps would leave a mark on muddy ground, whether the postmaster would notice a box just a little too heavy, or that the delivery address had been scrawled by an unfamiliar hand. And the roads themselves were treacherous. Travel was slower than wagons, horses, ferries. All of them required interaction with strangers. Every toll booth, every innkeeper, every porter at a station, each one had the power to notice something, or to say nothing. And those silences, those moments when someone decided to look away instead of look closer, those were what made escape possible. Even the cities, with their crowds and shadows, were not always safe havens. Free black communities existed in places like Philadelphia and Boston, but their freedom was tenuous. Kidnappers operated openly, snatching individuals off the streets and selling them back into slavery. To be free did not mean to be safe. It meant, sometimes, to be pursued. So when Henry Brown climbed into his box measuring just 3 feet, long, 2 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep, he wasn't just entering a crate. He was entering an in-between space, a vessel not just for his body, but for all his hopes. He was gambling that geography could be tricked, that a line on a map could be crossed in a way no one would expect by post. What he counted on, what so many others counted on, was the underground geography, the geography of kindness, of risk, of secret handshakes and prearranged signals. This was a second America, buried beneath the first, a country not of flags and declarations, but of gestures and hiding places. There were stations on this hidden map, safe houses, barns, attics, even churches, and conductors those brave enough to guide runaways along the path, one cautious step at a time. But unlike trains, these conductors didn't wear uniforms, and there were no whistles to signal departures. Just trust, patience, and a kind of courage that made no noise. And still, even this second map was fragile. It could collapse at any moment. A betrayal, a missed signal, a door that failed to open. For every successful escape, many others were caught, whipped, sold further south, or simply disappeared. But geography was not destiny, and those who learned to read its hidden paths, those, like Henry, rewrote their own fate, not with swords or armies, but with patience, with cleverness, with boxes and breath. And perhaps, somewhere in all this, there's a quiet reminder that even when the world builds its walls high, there are still cracks, still tunnels, still secret paths worn smooth by hope. Let us rest here a moment longer before turning our gaze toward another form of escape, one that lived not in routes and roads, but in pages. Imagine for a moment how precious a word can be when it's forbidden. Not a speech, not a novel, just a word, a name, a date, a verse from Scripture. Now imagine having to hide that word like a flame, cupping your hands around it to shield it from the wind of suspicion. In the American South during slavery, literacy was not merely discouraged for enslaved people, it was criminalized. Teaching, Someone to read could mean fines, imprisonment, or worse. The logic behind this harshness was simple and chilling. A literate slave was a dangerous slave. Reading meant access to knowledge. It meant reading the Bible and seeing stories of deliverance. It meant reading a poster and understanding that someone was offering a reward for your capture. It meant reading a map or a shipping label. And writing? That was power distilled into its most portable form. Henry Brown could read. We don't know precisely how he learned, but we know that once the door to literacy cracked open, he walked through it. Words became his allies, his tools, his escape route. Consider how vital writing was to his plan. The box had to be addressed. The label had to be convincing. A man named James C. A. Smith helped arrange it all. A free black man who, alongside another named Samuel Smith, no relation, crafted the logistics down to the letter. Henry's own understanding of how mail worked, how labels were read, how addresses were structured, this came not from guessing, but from learning. But beyond his own story, literacy was a quiet rebellion repeated across plantations and towns. Some learned letters from white children, trading small favors for a lesson in the dirt with a stick. Others studied by firelight after long days in the field, tracing the alphabet in their minds when no paper could be found. For many, the Bible was both the primer and the goal. Reading it offered not just spiritual comfort, but hidden meanings. Messages of liberation, codes, and teaching? That was even braver. Some enslaved people taught others in secret late at night, behind the barn, in corners of churches. These weren't formal schools. They were whispered syllables and worn pages, passed hand to hand, each lesson a risk, each sentence a seed. The South feared this deeply. Laws were passed. Homes were searched. Punishments were doled out. And yet the learning continued. Because words, once glimpsed, cannot easily be forgotten. Even for those who never escaped physically, literacy was a kind of mental liberation. It allowed people to read letters from loved ones, to write their own names on documents when freedom was finally won, to participate in the fragile civic life that lay ahead. For Henry, reading meant something more. After his escape, he became an author. He told his story. He stood before crowds in the North and in England, speaking not just for himself, but for all those whose voices had been smothered. The same. Hands that had once pressed tobacco leaves now turned pages. The same mind that had once been forced to memorize orders now composed paragraphs. Reading gave Henry a second life. Writing gave him a legacy. And for us today, it gives a thread. A line connecting us to that quiet moment when someone, somewhere, whispered a letter. A, B, C, simple, subversive, sacred. Let us pause here. Let the letters rest gently in your thoughts. When we return, we'll begin to explore the unexpected chapter, not about the enslaved or the underground, but about the post office itself. Because even institutions built for commerce and convenience can become vessels of revolution under the right circumstances. Imagine a place where the world feels so orderly, so repetitive, that it might as well run on clockwork. The post office of the mid-19th century was exactly that, a kingdom of schedules and stamped envelopes, uniformed clerks and leather mailbags. It was not meant to be subversive. It was meant to be predictable. And that, in its own quiet way, made it the perfect hiding place. The postal system of the 1840s and 1850s was among the most advanced in the world. Trains, steamboats, and horse-drawn. Wagons carried letters across vast distances. Postmasters were charged with maintaining precise ledgers. Delivery routes crisscrossed state lines and social boundaries. It was, to most, a public utility necessary but unremarkable. But to Henry Box Brown, it was something far more. Radical, a loophole. To mail oneself from slavery to freedom required more than courage. It required a system so large and impersonal that it would never stop to wonder about what was inside a single wooden crate. Let's take a moment to picture the box. It was not custom-made. It was ordinary, nondescript, rough-hewn wood with simple nails. Inside, Henry curled himself into a space scarcely big enough to hold him. He carried with him a small bladder of water, some biscuits, and a single all-sharp tool to poke air holes. Nothing more. The label? Addressed to William Johnson, a member of the Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. The shipment? Dry goods. And so, on March 23, 1849, a delivery left Richmond, Virginia. Not a package, not a parcel in act of defiance, shaped into 3 feet by 2 feet by 2, 5 feet of hope. The journey was more complicated than a simple point A to point B. It involved multiple carriers, handoffs, delays. At one point, the box was dropped. Henry later recalled the moment he felt himself tumbling head over heels, unable to cry out. Another time, he was placed upside down for hours. He nearly fainted. Still, he remained silent. Still, the box moved forward. The postal clerks had no idea. They stamped it, shifted it, passed it along. It moved across state lines, through post stations where some workers were pro-slavery, others ambivalent, and a few unknowingly smuggling freedom across the very lines meant to divide. When the crate finally arrived at the anti-slavery office, a small group gathered around it. They had been warned. And still, they were uncertain. Slowly, they opened the lid. Henry unfolded himself, stiff and drenched in sweat. And then he spoke. "How do you do, gentlemen?" It was not just a greeting. It was a declaration. A man, once property, had arrived as a parcel and emerged as a person. The post office never knew. Not officially. It continued its work, carrying mail across the country, letters home, packages of thread, receipts, and sometimes, though only once that we know of, a man. That moment, quiet as it was, remains one of the most ingenious uses of public infrastructure in the history of American resistance. A government system built to move commerce and news was turned just for a moment into an instrument of human liberation. It wasn't just Henry who saw the post office's power. Abolitionist newspapers traveled in the mail. So did anti-slavery pamphlets. So did letters of hope, information, coordination. While censors did exist, and many Southern postmasters refused to deliver abolitionist literature, there was always a crack. A shipment overlooked. A letter misfiled. For the enslaved and those fighting for their freedom, these cracks became passageways. The post office was never meant to be political. And yet, like all systems, it reflected the society around it. Sometimes it upheld slavery, and sometimes, unknowingly, it carried its undoing. So tonight, as you lie in the stillness of your own room, perhaps think of that small box on a wagon, the rattle of wheels, the hush of papers, and deep inside, a man holding his breath, listening not just for footsteps or discovery, but for arrival. Let us turn now to Henry's life after the box. For his journey was not over when the lid was lifted. In many ways, it had only just begun. Emerging from that crate, Henry Brown might have hoped for a quiet life, a moment to breathe, to walk under an open sky and feel the ground beneath his feet without fear. But fate, ever curious, had other plans. Henry's arrival in Philadelphia was greeted not only with astonishment, but with urgency. News of his escape spread quickly through abolitionist circles, and while many celebrated, others worried. The Fugitive Slave Act loomed large, soon to be reinforced in 1850, turning even free states into potential danger zones. And so, Henry did not rest. He spoke, he wrote, he performed. His first audience was modest a few abolitionists and sympathizers, eager to hear the story of the man who had mailed himself to freedom. But the story grew legs. It moved through word of mouth, through pamphlets, and eventually through stages. Henry adopted a new name, Henry Box Brown, a reminder of where he had come from and how he had escaped. He traveled through New England giving lectures. Sometimes he simply recounted his tale. Other times he brought the box itself on stage. There he would climb in and climb out again, reenacting his escape not just as memory but as theater. For some, it was inspiration. For others, spectacle. The 19th century was not a time shy about performance. Magic shows, scientific demonstrations, moral lectures all jostled for attention in public halls. Henry found his space in this swirl. His life, shaped by confinement, now unfolded on open platforms. He stood, tall and articulate, before crowds who might never have imagined the cruelty of slavery until he described it in his own words. But public life brought risks. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. It allowed enslavers to reclaim escapees even from free states. It deputized ordinary citizens to assist. It made every street corner suspect. For Henry, the danger was immediate. He was still legally property. His former enslavers could appear with a marshal and demand his return. So he fled again, this time not in a box, but on a boat. Across the Atlantic to England. In England, he found relative safety. There was no slave code there, no threat of capture. He continued to lecture, to perform, to write. He published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Henry Box Brown, offering the world not just a story of survival, but a blueprint of ingenuity and will. He stayed in England for years. He married again, had children, formed a small theatrical troupe. He even became a magician, incorporating illusions into his storytelling. There's something deeply poetic about that. A man once forced to hide, his very self now mastering the art of controlled concealment, turning disappearance into drama. And yet, even amid performance and applause, one senses a quiet yearning. For home, for dignity, for a life not shaped by defiance, but by peace. Eventually, Henry returned to the United States. The war had come and gone. Slavery was abolished. The nation he returned to was different, but far from perfect. Records suggest he continued to perform, now as a free man, a husband and father. His exact final years are unclear. History fades at the edges, as it often does. But the image of him remains, calm, composed, emerging from a box with words instead of weapons. His was a life lived in defiance of boundaries, legal, physical, and social. And though history tends to remember him for the box, perhaps it's worth remembering too the breath he drew when it opened. The quiet dignity of a man reclaiming his life, one word at a time. As we rest here at the edge of his story, let us remember that sometimes freedom does not arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives as a wooden crate slid into a quiet room, opened slowly, gently, until light spills in. When you're ready, we'll drift toward another world within this world. The stories of those who tried to follow in Henry's footsteps and those who failed. Not every story of self-liberation ends with a man stepping triumphantly from a box. For every Henry Box Brown, there were others, men, women, and children who dared to dream of escape through similarly bold methods, and who faced consequences far more harrowing. The peculiar genius of Henry's plan did not go unnoticed. Word of his escape spread not only among abolitionists, but within the enslaved community itself. Whispers circulated among trusted hands in kitchens, among laborers walking home beneath the twilight hush. A box, some biscuits, a few holes for air and freedom. It sounded simple. It sounded achievable. It sounded, most of all, possible. But as with all miracles, there was danger in repetition. In the months and years after Henry's escape. Others attempted similar feats. Records are sparse, often deliberately so, but stories have survived. A man in Georgia tried to stow away in a crate headed for New York. A young woman disguised herself as a boy and squeezed into a shipping trunk bound for Philadelphia. Another man hid in a barrel marked for provisions. These efforts were not always met with the same luck. One box was mishandled, the occupant discovered and beaten. Another was left too long in the sun. Its would-be passenger suffocated before arriving. In at least one case, the crate never reached its destination. The shipping label had fallen off. What these attempts reveal is not carelessness, but desperation. To be willing to fold one's body into a wooden container, to place one's very breath in the hands of strangers, is an act born of courage, but also of the relentless cruelty that made such choices feel rational. Those who tried were not naive. They knew the risks. But the burden of slavery, its daily humiliations, its theft of time, its constant threat of violence, could make a coffin-sized box look, for a moment, like a doorway. And yet, Henry's story was unique not just because it succeeded, but because it was supported. He had allies. William Still and the Anti-Slavery Society were waiting on the other end. Timing had worked in his favor. The weather, the train schedules, the silence of postal clerks all aligned, however improbably. Others were not so fortunate. Still, some persisted with equal ingenuity. One woman posed as her enslaver's property, escorted north by a light-skinned companion pretending to be her owner. Another man impersonated a sailor, forging papers and walking brazenly onto a ship bound for freedom. These were acts of quiet brilliance, and each time one succeeded, it sent tremors through the institution of slavery, not enough to topple it, but enough to crack its illusion of control. The reaction from slaveholders was one of alarm. Laws were tightened. Southern states demanded stricter enforcement of fugitive return policies. Rewards were raised. Suspicions deepened. Southern ports increased inspections. Even luggage began to be searched more thoroughly. In some cities, crates required authorization before being shipped out of state. The very idea of a body inside, a box once absurd, had become, in their minds, dangerously plausible, and so the walls closed in. The underground routes became more secretive, more complex. For some, the passage to freedom moved underground, not metaphorically, but literally, through hidden basements, root cellars, and camouflaged wagons. But for all the risk, for all the loss, there remained a quiet, pulsing truth, the desire for. Liberty could not be boxed in forever. Tonight, as we rest our heads, we might reflect not only on Henry's daring, but on those who followed, those whose names we may never know, those who tried and failed, those who tried and died, and those who, in hushed voices around flickering lanterns, whispered about the man who mailed himself north and wondered if they, too, might one day disappear into a crate and reappear as free souls beneath northern skies. Tomorrow, we turn to a man whose life's work was to record these stories. A quiet clerk with a tidy ledger and a memory like Iron William Still, the underground's archivist. There are men who lead from platforms, and there are men who lead from desks. William Still, unassuming and bespectacled, preferred the latter. In a world straining under the weight of injustice, Still's weapon of choice was the pen, and his battlefield, a narrow office cluttered with records and secrets. He worked for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, managing correspondence and logistics. It was not glamorous work. The hours were long, the pay modest. He did not carry fugitives on his back through snowy woods. He did not leap onto moving trains, but he was, in many ways, the spine of the Underground Railroad. Each time someone escaped, each time a person emerged from a hiding place with trembling legs and a half-whispered name, William Still was there to greet them. he asked questions, not out of suspicion, but of care. Where had they come from? Who was still enslaved? Could he write to someone safely? He wrote it all down, in meticulous, patient script. These were not anonymous notations. He recorded names, family ties, skills, places of origin, distinguishing marks. Because William still believed something radical, that black lives deserved history, that these men and women were not mere statistics in the great moral drama of abolition, but individuals full and sacred in their personhood. Henry Box Brown passed through his office, as did hundreds of others. Still welcomed them not with fanfare, but with ink. He documented Brown's escape, even including a sketch of the crate. He catalogued the hardships, the cleverness, the heartbreaks. Still's office became a sanctuary, not only for the body, but for memory. And memory, in those days, was fragile. One wrong word could expose an entire route. A single slip of the tongue could collapse months of planning. That Still kept such detailed records was both miraculous and dangerous, so he hid them. Not buried in dirt or sewn into clothes, but tucked away in secret drawers, beneath floorboards, behind false panels and cabinets. There, the names of the escaped lived on even as the system that sought to erase them still roared outside. After the war, when slavery had finally been abolished, Still did something bold. He opened his drawers and published what he called the Underground Railroad Records, book brimming with the names, routes, and memories of those who had dared to flee and those who had helped. It was not just a chronicle. It was a monument. What makes Still's work so quietly breathtaking is its humanity. He did not embellish or romanticize. He recorded truths, the fear, the hunger, the grief of a mother who left her child behind, the smile of a father who saw his daughter again after 10 years apart. The details that make a life so often lost in the sweep of time were preserved. Thanks to Still, we know not only about Henry Box Brown, but of hundreds more whose stories, otherwise, might have slipped into silence. He believed that freedom alone was not enough. That dignity required memory. That history should include the footprints of those who walked its most perilous roads. So tonight, as our eyes begin to close and our thoughts wander, let us tip our hats to the quiet archivist of escape, to the man who wrote when others ran, who remembered when others forgot, who listened, recorded, and stored the voices of those who were almost lost. And tomorrow, we'll turn the page gently to examine something more enigmatic, how the mail system and the Underground Railroad overlapped in ways both clever and confusing, threading packages, parcels, people, and whispers into the same web. The mail is something we take for granted today, a silent, steady pulse of delivery vans and stamped envelopes. But in the mid-19th century, especially in the years before the Civil War, the mail system was not just a channel for correspondence. It was a vessel for secrets, rebellion, and in more ways than one, the movement of freedom. Imagine the mail routes then, long and slow, yet vital, stagecoaches thudding over rough roads, saddlebags slung over horses, riverboats pushing along, muddy waters, trains howling through the night, each one pulling wagons filled with newspapers, merchant receipts, circulars, and sometimes people. The United States Postal Service, even in its early days, was an enormous bureaucratic web. And like most bureaucracies, it contained crack spaces where rules bent, where labels were misread, where contents were overlooked. Within those folds, some began to see opportunity. Some abolitionists realized that with the right disguise and a helpful shipping clerk, the mail could carry more than just parchment. It wasn't an official Underground Railroad route, not in the usual way, but it shared the same spirit, subversive, quiet, and reliant on a deep network of trust. Certain postmasters, especially in sympathetic towns up north, began turning blind eyes to suspicious crates. A package with strangely high insurance. A box that rattled slightly when nudged. No questions asked, no forms filed. Just a nod and a cart to the loading dock. On the southern end, however, scrutiny was increasing. In cities like Charleston or New Orleans, crates bound for the north were subject to careful review. Manifests were checked, locks were added, guards stood watch. Yet even there, loopholes remained. A bribed inspector, a distracted porter, a package misrouted by clerical error and rerouted by fate. And the mail wasn't only a literal escape route, it was a tool of organization. Abolitionists wrote coded letters. They used pseudonyms and vague phrasing, describing shipments of goods or special deliveries that referred, in fact, to human lives in transit. Many of these correspondences passed through William Still's hands. Others went to Quaker families across Pennsylvania, to station masters in Ohio, to black churches in New York. Entire towns became involved, their residents carefully folding messages into envelopes and sending them into the dangerous network of abolitionist logistics. The line between the post and the underground became blurred. Even Henry Box Brown's escape depended on postal infrastructure. A box was labeled for express delivery. He was technically handled by Adams Express Company, a private freight carrier often used for high-value packages, but one that worked closely with postal lines. His crate, after all, traveled on a mail train. It sat in the sorting rooms. It crossed state lines under government protections. Ironically, the same government that upheld the Fugitive Slave Act. That paradox was not lost on the abolitionists. They used the government's own machinery to dismantle the system of bondage quietly, methodically, without guns or banners, but with crates, stamps, and timetables. The postal system also carried abolitionist newspapers, like the Liberator, across the country smuggled into Southern homes under layers of other papers, or read aloud in the dead of night by enslaved persons who had learned, against all odds, to read. These papers told of escapes, of trials, of speeches. They created hope where there had only been silence. But of course, the system was also used to suppress. Pro-slavery forces intercepted letters. Some postmasters refused to deliver anti-slavery publications. Entire bags of abolitionist mail were burned in the town squares of the South. Once in Charleston, an angry mob seized bundles of Northern papers and lit them aflame in front of the post office while officials looked on. Fear had its own schedule. It traveled just as surely as hope. And yet, despite the censorship, messages continued to move. There's something strangely intimate about the mail. Someone touches a piece of paper in Virginia, writes a message, and days later, that same paper is in someone's hands in Philadelphia. In a time without phones, without email, this was magic. This was lifeblood. And for those seeking freedom or helping others to find it, the mail was a thread connecting distant lives in a fragile web of defiance. So tonight, we picture it, the quiet shuffling of letters in a candlelit room, the soft knock at a side door, delivering a parcel not just wrapped in cloth, but wrapped in meaning. A crate being gently pried open by trembling fingers, and inside, not a box of goods, but a man, breathing, alive, free. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Henry Brown's story turned into something bigger than himself. Not just a man who escaped, but a man who took center stage. Not every man who escapes slavery goes on to become a performer, but Henry Box Brown was never just a name in the newspaper. He had flair, he had vision, and after surviving a journey few dared to attempt, he stepped out of the box and into the spotlight. His escape in 1849 made headlines across the North. Abolitionist circles buzzed with excitement. Pamphlets were printed. Sermons were delivered. The man who mailed himself to freedom had arrived. And he wasn't shy. Henry quickly realized that people wanted to hear his story, and not just in church basements or dusty abolitionist halls. They wanted a show, something to witness, something to marvel at. And so Henry gave them exactly that. He took to the stage, quite literally, with a dramatized retelling of his escape. His act, often called Henry Box Brown's Mirror of Slavery, was a mix of storytelling, visual aids, music, and props, including, of course, the very box he had traveled in, which he brought on stage as a centerpiece. Imagine the scene. The lights dim. A hush falls over the crowd. Then slowly the box begins to creak. A lid is pushed open, and out rises Henry himself, dignified, poised, free. It was part lecture, part spectacle, and entirely unforgettable. His performances blended emotion with entertainment. He told the story of how he had been separated from his wife and children, sold away in Richmond just months before his escape. That wound never healed, and it gave gravity to his voice. He spoke of how the idea of mailing himself came not only from a desire to be free, but from the unbearable ache of being ripped from those he loved. Audiences wept. Others applauded. Many seeing slavery from a human face and hearing it in a living voice, left with their views forever changed. But there were critics too, especially among more conservative abolitionists. Some felt Henry's stage performances turned suffering into theater. They accused him of sensationalism. They worried that the cause was being overshadowed by personality, that he was making freedom a show. And yet, can one blame a man for reclaiming his narrative? For transforming the box that once held him in darkness into a platform for light? Henry wasn't simply performing. He was surviving, earning a living, in a world that still didn't want him equal, using the one thing he had, his incredible story, as both shield and sword. Eventually, as threats increased under the tightening grip of the Fugitive Slave Act, Henry fled again, this time voluntarily, to England. There, he continued to perform, but also found new avenues. He became a magician, a lecturer, even a singer. The box faded into metaphor. Freedom became something he carried in his voice now, not just in his crate. When he returned to America decades later, the world had changed. Slavery had been abolished, but Henry's tale remained, preserved not just in stills records or newspaper clippings, but in the memories of those who saw a man rise from a box and speak his truth. He turned his trauma into a torch, and he lit up the room. As we drift to rest, we might picture him one more time standing, center stage, one hand on the wooden edge of his crate, the other pointing skyward. Not just an escapee, not just a performer, but a man who turned his box into a pulpit, who turned his silence into speech, who, in the soft hush between gasps and applause, reminded a crowd what it meant to be free. Tomorrow, we'll explore the darker backdrop, the tightening of laws, and the long shadows cast by the Fugitive Slave Act, which made even the free North feel suddenly less free. Let us pause now, not to admire, but to understand, because the world that Henry Box Brown emerged into was not fully free, even in the North. It was conditional, precarious, and subject to the crushing gears of law. The box may have carried him across a line, but laws could erase lines as easily as they were drawn. In 1850, just 1 year after Brown's escape, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. It was not the first of its kind. Previous laws had allowed for the capture of runaway slaves, but this one was cruelly efficient. It brought the long shadow of slavery into every town and city of the North. It deputized ordinary citizens. It stripped away trials by jury. It turned freedom into a fragile thing, something that could be revoked, with a knock at the door or a whisper in the street. Imagine this new fear. A man like Henry, legally free in Pennsylvania, could be seized on the word of a single man claiming to be an owner. No need for evidence. No need for explanation. A commissioner paid more for returning a person than for releasing them could sign the order. And just like that, the box that had once carried him to freedom could be flipped back into a prison. The North grew tense. In Boston, mobs formed to resist slave catchers. Churches held vigils. Lawyers volunteered to defend fugitives. But still, people disappeared. Some were former slaves. Others were free-born black citizens who simply couldn't prove it. The law didn't much care for details. There are stories, too many of them, of lives unraveled overnight. Families who had lived in peace for years, suddenly packing their things and heading for Canada, where no American law could reach them. The Underground Railroad shifted its terminus farther north. Detroit, Rochester, Buffalo, they all became stopovers, not destinations. Freedom was now found across the water in Ontario. The law also widened. The gap between conscience and duty. Some sheriffs and clerks refused to enforce it. Others followed it coldly, citing their obligations. Friendships broke over it. Churches divided. And always the threat loomed of footsteps outside, of a name read aloud, of hands reaching for someone who had long thought themselves safe. Henry Brown knew this. That is why, not long after gaining his freedom, he left for England. Not out of preference, but out of necessity. The law was hunting him. There was every possibility that his crate, the very symbol of triumph, could be reopened in reverse an auction block instead of applause. And still, the work went on. Abolitionists grew louder. Writers like Frederick Douglass sharpened their pens. Harriet Beecher Stowe released Uncle Tom's Cabin, stirring Northern hearts into action. But for every heart stirred, another clenched. The country was drifting, quietly but steadily, toward conflict. The Fugitive Slave Act, in some ways, accomplished what decades of protest had not. It made the issue national, personal. Suddenly, slavery was not just a Southern institution. It was in your town square, in your courtroom, on your newspaper front page. And for many Northerners, that was a wake-up call. For others, it was a threat. But for the people living under its weight, especially escaped slaves, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder that freedom could not just be declared. It had to be defended daily, and at great cost. And still, even in that time of trembling freedom, some dared. Some opened their doors to strangers. Some sewed false papers. Some whispered directions across fences. And some, like Henry Brown, refused to be quiet. So as you rest tonight, think not just of the box, but of the law that tried to crush it, of the hands that passed along messages in the dark, of the families who woke before dawn, not to work, but to run. Tomorrow, we will follow that thread into the lives of those who ran not just once, but again and again, and those who helped them, with nothing to gain but the knowledge that they had stood, silently and firmly, on the right side of history. There are some who ran and never stopped running. Henry Brown was fortunate, if that word can be used. His escape succeeded, and though the law changed beneath his feet, he remained free. But others were not so lucky. They escaped once, tasted freedom, and were pulled back. And then, somehow, they found the strength to run again. Tonight, we sit beside those souls. Let us imagine a man named Elias, not so different from Henry. Elias ran from Virginia to Philadelphia. He worked as a carpenter, quiet and careful. He kept his papers on him, hidden inside his shirt every day. And then one afternoon, a knock at the workshop door. Two men, one with a badge, the other, a familiar face he thought he'd never see again. The man who had once owned him. In the span of an hour, Elias's life was folded back into a bag and loaded into a carriage. He was taken to a holding cell, where the law said he no longer belonged. To himself, no trial, no jury, just paperwork, just chains. They tried to send him back south, but word traveled fast. An abolitionist lawyer filed motions. A crowd gathered outside the courthouse. A delay, a storm. And in that plaza window, Elias slipped out through a basement grate and ran. Again. This time, he went north, all the way to Canada. He was one of many. There were women, two mothers, who carried children on their backs through snow. There was the story of Lucy, who disguised herself as a washerwoman to sneak her child out of a Baltimore hotel, where slave catchers were waiting in the lobby. Or of John, who crossed into Vermont by night, crawling through brush to avoid patrols. He had already escaped once from Alabama, but a cousin turned him in after recognizing him in a market. So he ran again. And this time, he ran farther. These stories were not rare. They were part of the rhythm of the time. A back-and-forth migration of courage and cruelty. And behind every escape, there were helpers. Station masters, as they were called. Not of trains, but of homes. Safe houses, churches, barns. A woman in Ohio who kept a false floor in her attic. A minister in Delaware who let strangers sleep in the choir loft. A child in Pennsylvania who left chalk marks on fence posts to show the way. None of them were famous. Most of them never told their stories. But without them, the ones who ran twice would not have made it. There is something deeply human in that, the idea that freedom is not always a straight path, that sometimes it is earned in pieces, in hours stolen, in miles walked barefoot, in hands extended from a stranger's porch. So as you drift deeper into rest, think of those moments. A candle lit in a back window, a knock answered without question, a bed made in a root cellar, a cup of water offered before dawn. Freedom was not just a destination. It was a trail of kindness, passed hand to hand, often in silence. And tomorrow, we'll move from the runaways to the ones who stayed, though still enslaved, but quietly, subversively resisting in place. Because not every act of freedom required running. Some took root exactly where they stood. Freedom did not always come with footsteps. It did not always involve escape routes or packed bags hidden beneath floorboards. Sometimes freedom was a whisper, a pause, a refusal so small it barely stirred the air, but it mattered. Because for those who could not run, who had children, who were too closely watched, or who simply had nowhere to go, resistance became a quiet daily ritual. Tonight, we turn to those who stayed. Imagine the rhythm of plantation life, the rising bell in the dark, the long, unbroken rows of cotton or tobacco stretching endlessly across the horizon, the overseer on horseback, the heat pressing down like another weight to carry. In that setting, resistance could look like very little at all, a broken tool, a slow gait, a song with double meaning, a look exchanged across a field, a recipe subtly altered to withhold flavor from a master's plate. None of it would make the newspapers. None would be etched in bronze. But these acts were part of a deeper defiance, one that asserted, I am still mine. There were those who passed on knowledge, teaching their children to read in secret, tracing letters in the dirt, whispering the sounds of words after dark. In many states, this was illegal, punishable by beatings or worse. But it persisted, passed on in quiet corners and flickering candlelight. Literacy was a form of resistance. Because once a person could read, they could imagine. Others preserved culture through songs, through stories, through naming traditions and funerary rites, and meals that honored what had come before. They braided the past into their present like thread into fabric, refusing to let it be unraveled. And still others found ways to disrupt the systems around them. They sabotaged equipment, fed misleading information to overseers, hid tools, lied about one another's whereabouts. It was a chess game played slowly, subtly, where survival was the prize, and every move had to be measured. There were also spiritual songs that held double meanings. To a passerby, they were just hymns. But within the community, they carried coded messages. Wade in the water. Swing low, sweet chariot. Follow the drinking gourd. These were maps, set to melody. They could tell you when it was safe to run, which direction to go, and where you might find help. And the body itself, so often commodified, could become a tool of resistance. There are accounts of women choosing to limit their pregnancies or end them altogether, unwilling to bring children into a life of bondage. It is a grim and painful truth, but within it lies a fierce assertion of agency. In a world where even one's own children could be sold, to choose what entered or exited the body was a radical form of control. Even humor-soft, careful, biting had its place. Jokes at the master's expense, shared only among trusted friends. Ridicule, turned inward and then shared, created a small circle of control. Laughter was a breath of freedom when nothing else could be claimed. There were spiritual resistances, too. Some adapted Christianity into a theology of liberation, seeing themselves as the Israelites awaiting an exodus. Others held on to ancestral religions, blending them into new forms that defied the homogenizing pressure of the master's world. In this, their souls resisted what their bodies were forced to endure. And perhaps most powerful of all, community. The building of families, not just by blood, but by choice. Aunties who weren't kin, brothers who weren't born together, mothers who adopted the young when biological parents were taken away. These networks became lifelines. They formed a web of belonging stronger than the fences that tried to contain them. So while not every person fled in a wooden box or darted through the trees at night, each of them, through patience, cleverness, and quiet fire, pushed back. And as you rest now, let yourself drift into their world not with pity, but with awe. Imagine a woman baking bread for someone who might betray her, but hiding a message in the folds of the cloth anyway. Picture a boy whittling a toy by the fire and whispering riddles his grandfather taught him, riddles that meant nothing and everything. Picture a man standing a little too long by the fence, listening, just listening, because even that, sometimes, was enough. Tomorrow, we'll meet the ones who made escape possible, not just the station masters or famous conductors, but the quiet allies, the ones whose names were never known, who risked everything to help someone they barely knew. Not all heroes wore shackles. Not all risked their lives under threat of capture. Some lived above ground. Some were white or Quaker or German immigrants. Some were poor farmers or widowed schoolteachers or ministers who took the Bible's call to compassion quite literally. What they had in common was the choice to risk much for someone they just met or might never meet again. Tonight, we walk quietly into their homes. Begin with a farmhouse in southern Ohio. It's dusk. The windows glow faintly with candlelight. A woman in her 50s is boiling water, humming softly. There's a knock at the back door. She doesn't flinch. She walks over, opens it just a sliver, and lets in two figures, muddy, quiet, breathing hard. She doesn't ask questions. She simply points to the ladder leading to the attic. This is how the Underground Railroad really worked. It wasn't a system of trains and timetables. It was a network of people mostly unknown to one another linked by trust, secrecy, and a shared refusal to let injustice stand unchallenged. There were routes, code words, signs. A lantern left in a certain window. A quilt hung with a particular pattern. A children's rhyme that was really a set of instructions. It was all subtle, gentle, quiet enough to pass beneath suspicion. Sometimes the helpers were well-known abolitionists like Levi Coffin, who reportedly aided over 3,000 fugitives. But more often, They were nameless. An old man who ferried people across the Ohio River under the cover of night. A teenage girl who left bread and water beneath a certain tree every Thursday. A blacksmith who kept a false wall behind his forge. They risked imprisonment, fines, public shame. Their homes could be searched, their livelihoods ruined, and still they helped. In cities like Philadelphia and New York, entire black communities organized themselves into protection networks. They held meetings, raised funds, housed strangers. Some offered forged documents. Others taught fugitives how to walk, speak, or dress like free citizens. And so many churches became sanctuaries. Not officially, not always. But ministers preached freedom from their pulpits. Choirs sang messages of hope. And beneath the floorboards, someone might be hiding, listening. Of course, not everyone supported this work. There were neighbors who turned a blind eye, and others who didn't. There were betrayals, raids, moments when the whole network threatened to collapse. But even so, the lines held, sometimes barely, sometimes only for a few hours. But those hours could mean everything. These were not perfect people. Some had their own prejudices. Some helped for complicated reasons. But the act of helping, of sheltering a stranger, of offering water, of holding silence when questioned was, in its own quiet way, revolutionary. And there were others, too. People within the system who bent it ever so slightly. A sheriff who took too long to file a warrant. A clerk who miscopied a name. A train conductor who looked the other way. Not every ally shouted. Some simply waited 5 extra minutes. And in that pause, freedom slipped through. So as you drift off tonight, think of those doorways, of the hands that opened them without, knowing who might be on the other side. Think of the soup warmed on cold nights, the blankets folded in attics, the boots dried by the fire. These were the hidden hands of history, the ones that moved gently but firmly in the direction of justice. And tomorrow we'll travel north to Canada, the final safe haven for so many, and explore what life looked like on the other side of that treacherous journey. Imagine yourself standing on the bank of a cold river, the water slow and deep, with the faint lights of a foreign shore shimmering just beyond. For many escaping slavery in the United States, this crossing was not merely geographical. It was a passage into a new world, a promise of safety and belonging. Canada, in the mid-19th century, stood as a beacon for those fleeing the unyielding reach of American laws. The border itself was not a marked line with fences and guards as we know it today. It was a shifting, often blurry frontier where forests gave way to fields, where the air smelled of pine and possibility. The journey north was fraught with peril through forests, thick with snow, across rivers slick with ice, and past towns suspicious of strangers. Yet the allure of Canada was a powerful magnet for those desperate for true freedom. Canada's abolition of slavery in 1834 had made it a refuge. Once beyond the border, former slaves were legally free. No longer were they subject to the Fugitive Slave Act or local slave catchers. And yet, freedom was not simply a matter of law. It was a new beginning, filled with challenges and uncertainty. Many escaped slaves arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and memories that refused to fade. They were strangers in a strange land, often facing harsh winters, unfamiliar customs, and economic hardship. Some found work on farms, others in burgeoning towns, and many in black communities that had been forming for years. One such community was in Ontario, where towns like Buxton and Dresden became well-known stops on the Underground Railroad. These were places where churches, schools, and homes were built by former slaves for former slaves, creating a space to nurture roots that slavery had tried to sever. Life in Canada was a mix of relief and resilience. People built schools to teach their children not only reading and writing, but also the history that had been denied to them. Churches became centers not just of faith, but of social organization and cultural preservation. Yet, despite the promise of freedom, discrimination did not disappear overnight. Many faced prejudice from neighbors, economic marginalization, and the lingering trauma of bondage. Still, the communities endured and flourished, passing down stories of escape and survival, creating new identities that were both American and Canadian. They celebrated holidays that reminded them of both past struggles and present hopes. They created art and music, blending African traditions with new experiences. Imagine now the contrast: a man who once was hidden in a crate, now standing in a sunlit field of Canada, breathing freely, watching his children play without fear. Yet that man still carried the weight of what he'd left behind. His journey was both an end and a beginning, wrapped in the quiet complexity of survival. For many, crossing into Canada was more than a single event. It was a gateway to a new life, one shaped by community, faith, and the slow, steady work of building a home where none had been possible before. As you listen tonight, picture those forests and fields, the careful steps of weary feet, the whispered instructions shared beneath starry skies, the hope that rose with every dawn. And tomorrow, we will look at how some who escaped returned, whether to help others or to confront the past, and how those journeys carried their own quiet courage. Not all journeys ended once freedom was reached. Some escaped slaves chose to return to America not as fugitives, but as allies, activists, and bearers of witness. These return trips were neither simple nor easy. They were deliberate acts of courage, sometimes undertaken in shadows, sometimes in full view, but always with heavy hearts and firm resolve. Imagine a man named James. He fled Virginia years earlier, now settled in Canada with his family. But stories from the South haunt him. New laws tightening oppression, families torn apart, friends still held in chains. James feels a pull, a need to go back, not as a slave, but as a messenger. The decision to return was fraught with danger. The Fugitive Slave Act still made travel risky. And though Canada offered sanctuary, it was not a home to many who remembered their lives in bondage. To cross the border again was to risk everything. Yet some did. They became conductors on the Underground Railroad, guiding others through secret routes. They smuggled letters, money, and information back into the South. They gave speeches, published pamphlets, and joined abolitionist societies. One notable example was Frederick Douglass, who, after escaping slavery, traveled widely to speak against the institution. Though he did not return as a fugitive, his tours and speeches connected the struggles of those still enslaved with the conscience of the free world. Others, like Harriet Tubman, repeatedly risked capture by returning south to lead family members, and others to freedom. Their journeys were physical, emotional, and symbolic. Each return was a bridge linking two worlds, two sets of lives, two futures. These return journeys also complicated the idea of freedom itself. What did it mean to be free if the past still demanded your presence? If chains were broken, but the shadows lingered? And for the communities left behind, the return of those who had escaped was a powerful reminder. Freedom was not just an escape from physical bondage, but an ongoing fight for dignity, justice, and recognition. Imagine the bittersweet reunions, hugs held tight, tears shed quietly, the sharing of news. From afar, the passing on of knowledge and courage, and sometimes the planning of the next escape. These journeys were a testament to the enduring bonds of family and friendship, forged in hardship and strengthened by hope. As you settle now, feel the weight of those footsteps coming and going, crossing borders of land and heart. The slow, steady rhythm of a people who refuse to be silenced or erased. Tomorrow, we will explore the role of women in these journeys, their unique challenges, strengths, and the vital roles they played in the quest for freedom. Imagine the quiet strength of a woman walking beneath a moonless sky, a small child clinging to her back, her bare feet brushing the cold earth. The journey to freedom was perilous for everyone, but for women it held unique challenges and unspoken burdens woven deep into their daily realities. While many stories focus on men who fled, women's journeys were often invisible threads holding the fabric of escape together. They were caretakers, protectors, and sometimes warriors in their own right. Their courage often went unnoticed in history's louder moments, but it was every bit as vital. Consider a woman named Harriet, though not the famous Tubman, but one of many who shared her spirit. Harriet fled with 3 children, none older than 7. She carried food wrapped in cloth, whispered directions from memory, and soothed frightened little ones who did not understand why the night felt endless. Women traveling alone or with children had to be especially cautious. The threat of capture was always present, but so was the risk of assault, a grim reality that layered every step with fear. Their silence was a shield, their watchfulness a weapon, yet women found ways to fight back. In secret, many passed on knowledge, songs that doubled as maps, signs woven into quilts, and coded language shared under breath. They tended wounds, not only of body but of spirit, in hidden camps and safe houses. They maintained hope. Women were also often the ones who stayed behind, supporting the networks that enabled others to run. They cooked, cleaned, sewed disguises, and cared for children of the community. Their homes became sanctuaries, places where fugitives could rest and regain strength. In many cases, it was a mother's love that drove the most daring escapes. Stories abound of mothers who disguised themselves as servants, or even as white. Women carrying their children to safety. The risk was immeasurable, but the stakes were higher. One woman, Anne Maria, walked 30 miles by night with her infant strapped to her chest. Another, Harriet Jacobs, spent years hiding in a tiny attic space, risking starvation to protect her children's future. Even when capture seemed inevitable, women's resilience shone through. They endured harsh punishments, but many kept their spirits intact. Some became leaders in abolitionist movements, their voices rising against the chains of silence. Their stories remind us that freedom was not won solely by running. It was sustained by love, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will. As you listen tonight, imagine the weight of a child, the softness of a shawl, the quiet prayers whispered beneath the stars. Think of the women who carried both hope and fear, sometimes in the same breath. Tomorrow, we will explore the networks that crisscross the country, the Underground Railroad in greater detail, and how countless unknown hands shaped the path to freedom. The term Underground Railroad evokes images of secret tunnels and bustling stations, but in reality, it was a vast, informal network of people, places, and codes that connected freedom seekers with allies. Picture the landscape: rolling hills, dense forests, small towns dotted with churches and farms. Across this terrain, invisible lines were drawn not, but in whispers and signals. The railroad was a journey stitched together by courage, trust, and careful planning. Each station was a safe house, a home or church or barn where a fugitive might rest, eat, and sleep before moving on. Conductors were guides who led groups or individuals from one station to the next, often risking arrest or worse. The distances varied. Some ran dozens of miles by night, others moved in shorter hops. But each step was vital. Communication was coded and subtle. Quilt patterns hung on fences might signal safe passage. Lanterns in windows conveyed messages. Certain songs, sung softly, told when to move or hide. The language was deliberate and careful, like a secret thread weaving the network tight. It was not an organized system in the modern sense. There was no central headquarters or official schedule. Instead, it was a patchwork of local efforts that grew organically, spreading from town to town, state to state. This decentralized nature was a strength. When one route was compromised, others opened. When a helper was arrested, the network adapted. This resilience meant that thousands were able to slip through. Many who helped were ordinary people with extraordinary courage. Farmers who hid fugitives in haylofts. School teachers who taught reading in secret. Merchants who provided supplies. And many free black communities, which served as critical hubs. Of support, the railroad was also a risky enterprise. Not everyone was sympathetic. Slave catchers roamed the roads, and bounty hunters tracked rumors. Being caught meant imprisonment, fines, or worse for both runaways and their helpers. But the stakes were clear. For those escaping bondage, the railroad was a lifeline. For those aiding it, a moral imperative. Imagine a conductor leading a small group through the night. The moon hides behind clouds, the air crisp with autumn chill. Every rustle of leaves sounds like a warning. Every distant bark is a threat. But forward they go, step by careful step, eyes on the horizon and hearts steeled with hope. The railroads. Success was not just measured in miles traveled or lives saved, but in the countless small acts of bravery-sharpened knives hidden in bundles. Messages passed between strangers, and doors opened wide without question. As you settle tonight, picture the secret quilt hanging in a window, the lantern glowing softly in the dark, the steady footsteps that carried so many to safety. And tomorrow, we'll delve into one of the railroad's most famous conductors, Harriet Tubman, and her quiet but fierce fight to lead others from slavery to freedom. Imagine a woman walking through the dense night woods, the stars a faint glow behind a veil of clouds. Her footsteps are deliberate and quiet, her eyes sharp in the dark. She is not just any traveler, but a conductor on the Underground Railroad 1. Of the most famous, and certainly one of the most fearless, Harriet Tubman. Harriet was born into slavery in Maryland, around 1822, and from an early age, she knew the taste of hardship and the price of chains. But it was not despair that marked her. It was a fierce, quiet resolve. In 1849, she escaped slavery herself, making the perilous journey north to freedom. But unlike many, she didn't stop there. She returned time and again, at least 13, known missions to guide others along the hidden paths. Her courage was remarkable. Imagine the risks. Every trip north was a shadow dance with danger. Patrols, slave catchers, informants lurked everywhere. One misstep could mean capture, brutal, punishment, or death, not just for Harriet, but for those she led. Yet she moved like a whisper through the woods, guiding family, friends, and strangers alike to safety. Harriet's knowledge of the land was profound. She understood how to read the stars, how to listen to the sounds of the forest, how to find water and shelter. She moved only at night, resting by day in hidden thickets or the attics of sympathetic homes. Her work was slow and steady, deliberate and patient. Her nickname, Moses, came from her role as a liberator, a guide through the wilderness toward the promised land of freedom. But unlike the biblical story, Harriet's journey was not a one-time exodus. It was a repeated commitment to pattern, oath, sacrifice, and hope. There is something deeply human about this rhythm. The return trip through shadows, the whispered reassurance to frightened companions, the quiet joy when a child's tears are replaced by smiles, the weight of knowing that every step matters. And yet, Harriet was also human, fierce but tired, determined but afraid. She carried injuries from an earlier beating, pain that never fully left her. She was wary of strangers and cautious of betrayal. But she also carried laughter and a deep sense of faith. Harriet's story is a reminder that freedom is not only about escape, but about the courage to return and help others find their way. It's about leadership born from love, endurance, and a refusal to accept injustice. As you listen tonight, imagine Harriet's footsteps on the forest floor, her soft voice guiding the lost, her fierce eyes scanning the horizon for safety. Tomorrow, we will look at the broader abolitionist movement, the people, ideas, and efforts that stirred a nation toward change. If Harriet Tubman was a whisper in the night, then abolitionists were the growing chorus calling for change. The fight against slavery was fought not only in shadows, but in pulpits, print shops, and public squares. Imagine the 19th century streets lined with pamphlets, newspapers, and posters, some printed quietly in back rooms, others distributed loudly in town halls. The abolitionist movement was diverse, including freed Black Americans, white allies, women's rights advocates, and radical reformers. Each brought their voice, their passion, and their strategies. One of the most famous was Frederick Douglass, a former slave whose eloquence and power moved crowds and readers alike. His speeches were carefully crafted, but delivered with quiet. Force never shouting, but never silent. Imagine a man standing at a lectern, his voice calm but unyielding, speaking truths that unsettled comfortable ears. There was William Lloyd Garrison, the white editor of The Liberator, whose fiery writings demanded immediate emancipation. His newspaper was a lightning rod for controversy, celebrated by some, vilified by others. Yet his persistence helped shift public opinion over time. Women also played crucial roles. Figures like Sojourner Truth and Lucretia Mott spoke not only against slavery, but also for women's rights, linking the struggles for freedom and equality. Their voices blended the personal and political, reminding listeners that justice was interconnected. Abolitionists used various tactics, from organizing anti-slavery societies to assisting escaped slaves, from petitioning legislatures to staging protests. Some favored gradual emancipation. Others demanded immediate freedom. This diversity sometimes caused friction, but also fueled the movement's strength. The fight was not easy. Abolitionists faced violent mobs, legal persecution, and social ostracism. Churches split over the issue. Families were divided. But slowly, their words and deeds laid the groundwork for broader change. Imagine a small-town meeting on a winter evening, people gathered around candlelight, reading aloud abolitionist papers, debating the morality of slavery. Or a bustling city street where a protest draws hundreds, their signs raised silently, but firmly. The abolitionist movement was not just political, it was deeply personal. Many had known slavery firsthand or through family. Their passion came from pain, from empathy, and from an unshakable belief in human dignity. As you settle into rest tonight, picture those quiet meetings, those printed pages, the determined faces of people who dared to speak truth to power. Tomorrow, we will explore how the tensions of this era escalated toward the Civil War and the profound consequences that followed. Imagine a country stretched thin, its seams pulling taut under the weight of opposing beliefs. In the decades before the Civil War, the United States was a land marked by contradictions, its vast promise shadowed by the persistent, painful reality of slavery. The question of whether the nation would allow slavery to expand into new territories was not merely political, it was a question of identity, morality, and survival. The tension between North and South simmered like a slow burn, not sudden but inevitable. The industrializing North, with its growing cities and factories, increasingly viewed slavery as incompatible with progress and justice. The South, where agriculture relied heavily on enslaved labor, feared losing its economic foundation and way of life. New laws and compromises attempted to patch this growing rift, but they often only postponed conflict. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all efforts to balance power between free and slave states. Each left scars, planting seeds of discord rather than peace. Imagine the debates in Congress heated, yet measured men, and women struggling over words that could decide the fate of millions. For many, the question was not abstract, but deeply personal. Families were divided, communities torn apart. In this climate, abolitionists became louder and more visible. Their calls for emancipation were met with fierce opposition and even violence. The infamous raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 by John Brown, though unsuccessful, sent shockwaves through the nation, a stark reminder that the conflict was no longer just political, but deeply existential. Meanwhile, enslaved people continued to resist in countless ways, quiet and bold. Some fled north, others sabotaged crops, and many preserved their humanity against all odds. Their struggle was a constant undercurrent in the nation's rising storm. As you imagine this time, its uneasy nights and tense days, picture the slow march of change, the growing chorus of voices, and the mounting pressure that would soon break into war. Tomorrow, we will explore how the Civil War unfolded and what it meant for those who sought freedom and those who fought to maintain it. The Civil War was unlike any conflict before it, a brutal, grinding struggle that tore the nation apart and left scars still visible today. For those enslaved, it was both a harrowing time and a moment of profound change. Freedom hung in the balance, caught between the cannon's roar and the hope for a new dawn. Imagine the fields where battles raged, vast, scarred landscapes under gray skies, the air thick with smoke and the cries of men far from home. Thousands of soldiers on both sides fought with grim determination, many unaware of the larger consequences their sacrifices would carry. For enslaved people, the war was a collision of fear and opportunity. As Union armies advanced, some escaped plantations to seek protection behind their lines. Others joined the fight themselves, enlisting in regiments like the United States. Colored troops, where they faced prejudice, but also fought fiercely for freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 was a turning point, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. Yet freedom was not immediate, nor universal. It was a promise that needed to be won on battlefields and in hearts. The war's toll was immense. Families were separated, some forever. Homes were burned, lives were lost in staggering numbers. Disease swept through camps as mercilessly as bullets. The cost of freedom was paid in blood and heartbreak. And yet, amid the devastation, moments of humanity flickered, letters exchanged between loved ones, acts of kindness by soldiers on both sides, the determination of freed people to build new lives even before the war ended. Imagine a woman standing at a camp's edge, clutching a child, watching a distant battle unfold with both hope and dread. Or a young man, once a slave, now a soldier, standing tall despite the exhaustion, driven by the dream of liberty. The war ended in 1865 with the Union's victory and the abolition of slavery, but the path ahead was uncertain. The nation would have to grapple with how to rebuild, reconcile, and truly realize the promises of freedom. As you rest tonight, let yourself breathe with those who lived through these times, their pain, their courage, their enduring hope. Tomorrow, we will look at the difficult era of Reconstruction and the struggles that followed freedom's formal arrival. Imagine the dawn after a long, cold night, a sky tinged with pale light, but still carrying the chill of darkness. This was the era of Reconstruction, the fragile moment when the United States tried to stitch itself back together and give meaning to the freedom won at such great cost. For formerly enslaved people, Reconstruction was both a time of hope and uncertainty. Imagine families reunited after years apart, children learning their true names for the first time, communities building schools and churches from scratch symbols of a new life taking root. The promise of this era was profound. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th guaranteed citizenship. The 15th aimed to secure voting rights for black men. These were monumental steps on paper, full of promise and possibility. Yet, the reality was far more complicated. Imagine towns where these new laws clashed with old resentments, where newly freed people tried to claim their rights and faced intimidation, violence, and legal obstacles. The political landscape was a battlefield, not only of armies but of ideas. Freedmen's Bureau agents worked tirelessly to provide education, health care, and legal support, but their resources were limited, and their work met resistance. Many black Americans were elected to local and state offices, bringing new voices into government, but these gains were fragile. Sharecropping became a common, though imperfect, economic system. It was a delicate balance, a step away from slavery's chains, but often trapping families in cycles of debt and poverty. The soil was fertile, but so was the soil of inequality. Imagine a mother teaching her children by candlelight in a tiny schoolhouse, hopeful despite the threats outside. Imagine a community gathering for a Sunday service, singing hymns of deliverance and strength. These were acts of resilience in a world still shifting beneath their feet. Reconstruction was also a time of violence. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, wielding terror to undo progress. Night rides, lynchings, and intimidation were grim realities that tempered hope with fear. And yet, amid the darkness, there was light stories of activism, education, and community building that would lay the foundation for generations to come. The struggle for equality was far from over, but the roots had been planted. As you settle tonight, picture those fragile schoolhouses, the determined faces of newly freed families, and the quiet strength that carried them through. Tomorrow, we will explore the gradual rollback of Reconstruction's gains and the rise of Jim Crow laws that reshaped American society. Imagine a landscape bathed in the warm glow of a setting sun, but beneath it stretches a shadow, a long, oppressive shadow, cast by laws and customs designed to divide and diminish. This was the era of Jim Crow, a period when the promise of freedom was obscured by systemic segregation and discrimination. Following the retreat of federal protections at the end of Reconstruction, Southern states enacted laws that mandated racial segregation in schools, transportation, housing, and public spaces. These laws were often enforced with quiet cruelty, a slow tightening of the social fabric around black Americans. Imagine a young boy walking to a colored schoolhouse, its walls weathered and resources scarce, contrasted with the well-funded white schools just blocks away. Imagine a mother navigating segregated hospitals or public transportation, where dignity was often sacrificed. Jim Crow was not merely a set of laws, but a cultural force that permeated everyday life. The rules of separation were reinforced by social customs, threats, and violence. Black Americans were denied the vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. Yet resistance endured in countless quiet forms. Families nurtured traditions, churches remained pillars of community, and leaders emerged to challenge injustice. The era produced remarkable cultural achievements. Harlem Renaissance, for example, that celebrated black identity and creativity amid adversity. Imagine a church choir singing spirituals that echoed both sorrow and hope. Imagine a community gathering to hear a speaker calling for justice, their voices steady and unyielding. Jim Crow was a time of deep contradictions, a society that professed freedom yet practiced segregation, a nation that celebrated democracy while denying it to millions. As you listen tonight, picture the resilience woven through these years, the steady hands building homes, the whispered prayers in the dark, the slow but unbroken rhythm of life pushing against barriers. Tomorrow, we will look at the early civil rights movements that began to challenge these shadows and lay the groundwork for change. Imagine a quiet town hall filled with hushed voices, hopeful yet cautious, as a group gathers to discuss rights long denied. The early civil rights movement was born in places like these modest meetings, church basements, and community centers where courage took root in whispers before growing louder. For decades after the rise of Jim Crow laws, countless individuals and organizations worked steadily, though often unseen, to challenge segregation and discrimination. These early efforts laid the foundation for the sweeping changes yet to come. Think of the NAACP, founded in 1909, a beacon for legal battles against injustice. Through careful, deliberate challenges in courts, the NAACP chipped away at the walls. OF segregation, landmark cases like Brown v. Board of Education would eventually overturn the separate but equal doctrine, but that victory was decades away. Alongside legal efforts, ordinary people staged boycotts, sit-ins, and protests, often risking arrest or violence. These acts of quiet defiance were more than political gestures. They were affirmations of dignity and humanity. Women played pivotal roles as organizers, strategists, and speakers. Figures like Rosa Parks, whose refusal to give up her bus seat became a powerful symbol, demonstrated how everyday acts could ignite movements. Imagine a group of students sitting peacefully at a segregated lunch counter, their presence a gentle but unyielding challenge to injustice. Or a church congregation, singing hymns of freedom, their voices rising as both comfort and call to action. These early civil rights efforts were met with resistance, harassment, imprisonment, and even brutality, but the determination never waned. The rhythm of progress was slow, sometimes painfully so, but it was steady. Picture the hands that handed out flyers, the quiet conversations in kitchens plotting strategy, the tireless footsteps on dusty roads. Each small act was a thread woven into a growing tapestry of change. As you rest tonight, imagine the soft murmur of these meetings, the steady heartbeat of a community refusing to be silenced. Tomorrow, we will explore the landmark moments of the 1950s and 60s that brought civil rights into the national spotlight and transformed a nation. By the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement had gained momentum, its quiet murmurs swelling into a powerful current. The struggle for equality took center stage in America's consciousness, bringing to light decades of injustice with a new clarity and urgency. Imagine the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955. Rosa Parks, a weary seamstress, sits firmly on a bus seat, her quiet refusal sparking the Montgomery bus boycott, a nearly year-long protest at that, challenged segregation and galvanized a movement. The boycott demonstrated the power of collective action. African American communities, despite economic hardship, organized carpools, walked miles, and maintained their resolve. The peaceful resistance tested the nation's conscience and led to a Supreme Court ruling declaring bus segregation unconstitutional. Around this time, the emergence of charismatic leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave the movement a moral and spiritual voice. His belief in nonviolent protest and his stirring speeches inspired millions. Imagine King standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech, words measured and calm, yet brimming with hope and resolve. His vision was not just for legal equality, but for a society transformed by justice and brotherhood. Alongside mass marches and speeches, sit-ins at segregated lunch counters spread across the South. Young people, often students, faced jeers and violence with quiet courage. Each peaceful act chipped away at the walls of segregation. The Freedom Riders risked their lives by riding interstate buses through hostile territory, testing supreme court rulings and exposing brutal resistance. Behind these public acts were countless hours of planning, strategy, and prayer. Churches remained centers of organization and comfort, their pews filled with those who sought change through faith and action. Resistance from segregationists was fierce. Protesters were met with fire hoses, police dogs, and imprisonment. Yet the movement persisted, propelled by an unshakable belief in justice. Imagine the sound of hymns rising from a packed church, the quiet strength of hands clasped in prayer, and the steady footsteps of marchers moving down city streets. As you drift tonight, hold in your mind the faces of those who stood firm not out of anger, but out of love for their community and country. Tomorrow, we will explore the passage of landmark legislation that marked victories for civil rights and the challenges that followed. Imagine the halls of Congress in the mid-1960s, filled with the steady hum of voices debating the meaning of equality. After years of protests, marches, and sacrifices, landmark legislation was poised to reshape American life. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a monumental step. It outlawed discrimination in public places and employment, aiming to dismantle the legal structures that upheld segregation. This was not just a law, it was a promise, an official acknowledgement that separate but equal was no longer acceptable. Picture the moment when the act was signed into law, a quiet yet profound turning point. For millions, it was a breath of fresh air after decades of systemic barriers. Public schools, restaurants, theaters, all places where segregation had been routine, were now legally open to all. But change did not come overnight. Resistance lingered, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. Many communities struggled to implement the new rules, and prejudice did not vanish with a signature. At the same time, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 addressed one of the most insidious barriers: the denial of voting rights to Black Americans. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation had long kept many from the ballot box. This act sought to remove those obstacles and empower citizens to participate fully in democracy. Imagine the courage of those who registered to vote in the face of threats and violence. Their determination transformed politics and reshaped communities. These laws were victories, yes, but they were also starting points. The struggle for equality would continue in courts, neighborhoods, and hearts. As you listen tonight, picture the faces of those who marched for their rights, the quiet relief of casting a first vote, and the slow but steady unfolding of justice. Tomorrow, we will consider the ongoing challenges and the continuing fight for equality in the decades that followed. The passage of civil rights legislation was a beacon, yet the path toward true equality remained winding and uneven. Imagine a nation grappling with change laws rewritten, old habits challenged, but new obstacles emerging. In the years following the 1960s, many African Americans made remarkable strides in education, business, and politics. The growth of a Black middle class and the election of Black officials brought hope and representation. Yet systemic inequalities persisted in housing, employment, education, and justice. Economic disparities and racial profiling became new frontiers of the struggle. Imagine neighborhoods divided by redlining maps, schools underfunded despite legal mandates, and communities organizing to push back against discrimination in subtle but pervasive forms. Movements like Black Power emerged, emphasizing pride, self-determination, and sometimes a more militant stance. These were responses to frustrations with slow progress and ongoing injustice. The decades that followed saw the rise of leaders like Jesse Jackson, Angela Davis, and others who broadened the conversation around race, class, and social justice. Meanwhile, the nation continued to confront its past through education, memorials, and debates about how to remember history. Museums and documentaries helped preserve stories once hidden. Imagine classrooms where students learn about slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the civil rights movement with new depth and honesty. The fight for equality remains active today. Issues like police violence, voting rights restrictions, and economic inequality remind us that the journey continues. As you rest tonight, hold in your mind the long thread of history, from secret escapes to mass movements and the enduring human spirit that weaves it all together. Tomorrow, we will reflect on personal stories that illuminate this ongoing journey. Imagine sitting by a softly crackling fire, listening to the voices of those who lived through history's most difficult chapters. Personal stories bring life to broad events, allowing us to glimpse the human experience beneath the weight of dates and laws. Take the story of Solomon Northup, a free black man kidnapped into slavery. His tale, told in 12 Years a Slave, reveals the harsh realities of bondage, but also the resilience of hope. Imagine his confusion, his nights filled with fear, and his determination to reclaim freedom. His story is a reminder that freedom was never guaranteed. It was fought for every day. Or consider the quiet bravery of Harriet Ann Jacobs, who spent years hiding in a cramped attic space to protect her children. The cramped air, the dim light filtering through a small window, these were her world for long months. Yet her spirit endured, fueled by love and a yearning for freedom. Her memoir became a powerful testament to women's experiences under slavery. Then there are stories like those of Frederick Douglass, who taught himself to read and write despite laws forbidding it. Picture a young boy stealing moments with borrowed books, his fingers tracing letters that opened new worlds. His voice later became a clarion call for justice. Personal stories often reveal contradictions, the fear and the courage, the despair and the hope, the cruelty and the kindness. They show us individuals navigating impossible choices, holding on to dignity amid hardship. Imagine the sound of whispered conversations in hidden rooms, the touch of a hand offering comfort, the shared meals in secret gatherings. These moments, small but profound, shaped history's course. As you listen tonight, let these stories wash over you like a gentle tide reminding us that history is not just events, but lives filled with dreams, fears, and love. Tomorrow, we will explore the broader cultural legacy left by those who escaped bondage and those who fought for freedom. Imagine a landscape filled with songs, stories, art, and traditions, echoes of a people's enduring spirit despite centuries of hardship. The cultural legacy of those who escaped slavery and fought for freedom is a rich tapestry woven through music, language, and community. Spiritual songs, born in the fields and secret gatherings, carried messages of hope and resistance. Their melodies, often haunting and beautiful, were both prayers and maps. Imagine voices rising softly at dusk, singing of crossing rivers, and finding freedom, the words layered with meaning only understood by those who knew the journey. These songs became the foundation of blues, jazz, gospel, and eventually soul music genres that have shaped American culture and influenced the world. Their rhythms and themes echo the resilience and complexity of Black experience. Language, too, carries legacy. Dialects and storytelling traditions passed down from African roots blended with new influences, creating vibrant oral histories. Imagine elders sharing folk tales by the fire, preserving history through narrative and humor. Visual art, quilting, and crafts also hold stories. Quilts, once practical objects, became coded messages in the Underground Railroad. Each pattern and stitch carried meaning beyond its beauty, a silent language of freedom. Cultural festivals and celebrations honor ancestors and affirm identity. They are moments of remembrance and joy, connecting past to present. Yet this legacy is also a reminder of loss of families, torn apart, languages lost, and histories erased. The effort to reclaim and celebrate this heritage continues. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the soft hum of a spiritual, the colors of a patchwork quilt, the warmth of community gathered in song and story. Tomorrow, we will close our journey with reflections on how this history shapes us today and the quiet hope that carries forward. As you settle into rest tonight, imagine the soft turning of a page in a well-loved book, each chapter closing gently, but its story lingering in your mind like a faint melody. Our journey through this history, marked by struggle and courage, comes to a thoughtful close, inviting reflection and quiet hope. History is often told through grand events and sweeping movements, but it is also woven from countless small moments, the whispered prayers, the steady footsteps in moonlit forests, the shared meals in hidden rooms. These threads, delicate yet strong, create a tapestry that continues to shape us. Consider the man who mailed himself to freedom, a symbol not just of desperate escape, but of the boundless yearning for dignity and self-determination. His journey was slow, hidden, and fraught with risk, yet it speaks to a universal human desire to be free, to claim a place in the world on one's own terms. This story, like so many others from this era, reminds us that freedom is neither simple nor guaranteed. It is a constant struggle, a labor of hope and courage, and sometimes of quiet sacrifice. Imagine the lives of those who followed, those who continued to challenge injustice, who raised their voices for equality, who built communities and cultures that thrive despite adversity. Their legacy is not only in history books, but in the rhythms of daily life, the music we hear, the stories we tell, the values we hold. And yet, the shadows of the past linger. The inequalities and divisions that grew from centuries of bondage and discrimination still ripple through society. Recognizing this is part of honoring history, fully acknowledging pain alongside progress and the work that remains. As you close your eyes tonight, picture the faces of those who came before their hopes, fears, and enduring spirit. Let their courage be a quiet comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit seeks light. Our shared history invites us to listen deeply, to understand, and to carry forward a commitment to justice and empathy. It asks us to remember that freedom, once won, requires vigilance and care. Thank you for joining this journey on Stories for Sleep. May the lessons of the past gently guide your dreams and your waking moments alike. And if you enjoy drifting through these stories, don't forget to subscribe and let us know where and when you listen. Your presence turns history from distant echoes into a shared, living memory. Good night, and may your rest be peaceful.